Sometimes the things we save end up saving us. Sometimes a man who's lost everything finds exactly what he needs in the most unexpected place. Silas Boone has been living alone in the Wyoming mountains for 8 years now. At 57, the old frontiersman built his cabin far from civilization, where the only sounds are wind through pine trees and his own footsteps on wooden floors. He's made his peace with solitude, or at least he tries to convince himself of that every morning. But when he finds what looks like a dying kitten by his woodpile, something stirs in his chest that he thought had died long ago. He takes the little creature in, feeds it, names it Whiskey. What he doesn't know is that this isn't just any ordinary kitten. As Whiskey grows, Silas begins to realize he may have invited something wild and dangerous into his quiet life. What happens when the thing you rescue isn't what it seems? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist hung low across the valley floor that October morning, thick as sheep's wool and twice as stubborn. Silas Boone stepped onto his covered porch, coffee mug steaming in his weathered hands, and watched the sun struggle to burn through. The grey. At 57, he'd learned not to hurry the world along. The mist would lift when it was good and ready, same as everything else in these mountains. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, built with logs he'd felled himself, and stones he'd hauled up from the creek bed below. Every board, every chink of mud between the logs, every hand-forged nail spoke of 8 years of patient work. The structure wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last through Wyoming winters that could freeze a man's breath before it left. His lungs. Silas took a slow sip of coffee and let his gaze wander over his small kingdom. The woodshed stood to his left, filled with split pine and oak that would see him through to spring. Beyond that, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside kept his preserved meat and vegetables safe from both bears and bitter cold. To his right, a small corral held no animals now, hadn't for 3 years, not since his old mule Chester had passed. Some mornings, he still caught himself looking for that stubborn grey head poking over the fence rails. The nearest neighbor lived too hard. Days ride through mountain passes that could turn deadly without warning. Most folks would call it lonely up here. Silas preferred to think of it as peaceful. He'd had his fill of people and their complications down in the settlements. Up here, a man's word was worth exactly what his actions proved it to be, and the only politics that mattered were whether you had enough firewood and whether the creek would freeze solid come January. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object that caught the morning light. A thin gold chain with a simple wedding band threaded through it. Mary's ring. 8 years since the fever took her, and he still carried it everywhere, worn smooth by his thumb during long evenings by the fire. The ring reminded him of softer hands, gentler laughter, and the way she used to hum while kneading bread dough. Mary would have loved this place, he thought. She always said he was part mountain goat anyway, the way he took to high places. But Mary was gone, buried in the church cemetery down in Millerville, and Silas had come here to live with her memory, in peace, or to hide from it, depending on how honest he was feeling on any given day. The sound of something small moving near his woodpile broke his reverie. Probably a chipmunk, or maybe a pack rat looking for shelter. Silas finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. Time to get to work. October meant final preparations for winter, and winter in the Wyoming territory didn't forgive the unprepared. But the sound came again, a thin, desperate mewing that made him pause. That wasn't any chipmunk. Silas walked around the side of his cabin, his worn boots crunching on frost-brittle grass, and peered behind the neat stack of split logs. There, huddled against the foundation stones like it was trying to become part of the rock itself, was the smallest, most pathetic excuse for a kitten he'd ever seen. The little thing was maybe 6 weeks old, covered in mud and what looked like dried blood. Its fur was so matted and filthy that he couldn't even tell what color it was supposed to be. One eye was crusted shut, and it trembled so violently he would thought it might shake itself apart. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas muttered, crouching down. The kitten lifted its head at the sound of his voice, fixing him with one bright green eye that held more intelligence than he expected. It mewed again, a sound so pitiful it seemed to reach right into his chest and squeeze. Silas had always been a practical man. Practical men didn't take in strays, especially not when winter was coming and resources were limited. Practical men understood that nature was harsh, and sometimes small creatures died, and that was simply how the world worked. But as he looked down at this tiny, desperate thing, he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was the same instinct that had made him carry wounded soldiers off battlefields during his younger days, the same impulse that had driven him to pull drowning calves from swollen creeks. Mary used to say he had a soft heart under all that. Mountain man gruff, and maybe she'd been right. "You're probably going to die anyway," he told the kitten, which responded by struggling to its feet and taking a wobbling step toward him. "And I don't know the first thing about caring for baby animals." The kitten mewed again and fell over. Silas sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. "Mary always said I was a fool for lost causes." He scooped up the tiny creature, surprised by how light it was. Probably weighed less than his coffee mug. The kitten didn't struggle, just pressed itself against his palm, seeking warmth. Its little heart beat so fast he could feel it through its matted fur. Inside the cabin, Silas set the kitten on an old blanket near the stone fireplace. The warmth seemed to revive it a little, and it began the slow work of cleaning itself with a tongue barely bigger than Silas's thumbnail. He heated some milk in a small pot and tried to figure out how to feed something so small. Eventually, he dipped a clean rag in the warm milk and let the kitten suck on it. The little thing latched on with desperate hunger, its tiny paws kneading the blanket. "Going to need a name, I suppose," Silas said, settling into his favorite chair with his hand-carved walking stick across his knees. The stick was made from mountain oak, worn smooth by years of use, and bore the initials SB and MB that he'd carved during the long, grief-filled winter after Mary's death. "Can't just keep calling you Kitten." The little creature had finished with the milk and was now attempting to groom its matted fur. As it worked, Silas could see patches of what looked like light brown and black underneath all the grime. Maybe a tabby of some sort, though it was hard to tell. "Whiskey," he decided. "You're about the color of good bourbon, and Lord knows you showed up when I needed a drink." Whiskey seemed to approve of the name, or at least didn't object. The kitten finished its cleaning as best it could and curled up on the blanket, a tiny paw tucked under its chin. Within minutes it was fast asleep, its whole body rising and falling with each breath. Silas found himself watching the sleeping creature with an intensity that surprised him. When was the last time he'd cared for anything that depended on him completely? When was the last time something had looked at him with such trust? He thought about Mary again, the way she'd fussed over injured birds and half-drowned field mice. She would have loved this little one, would have probably stayed up all night making sure it was comfortable and well-fed. Mary had always said that taking care of helpless things was part of what made them human. The afternoon passed quietly. Silas went about his usual chores, checking his snares, splitting more wood, inspecting the cabin's chinked walls for any gaps that might let in winter wind. But every half hour or so, he found himself coming back inside to check on Whiskey. The kitten slept deeply, occasionally twitching its whiskers or making small sounds that might have been dreams. As evening approached and Silas prepared his simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, Whiskey woke up and began exploring its new surroundings. The little creature moved with surprising confidence for something so young, investigating every corner of the one-room cabin with careful attention. When it found Silas's boots by the door, it spent several minutes sniffing them thoroughly, as if learning his scent. "Smart little thing, aren't you?" Silas observed, offering another milk-soaked rag. Whiskey accepted the feeding readily, its appetite clearly improved from the morning. That night, as Silas banked the fire and prepared for bed, he faced the question of where Whiskey should sleep. The logical choice was to leave the kitten on its blanket by the fireplace, warm and safe. But when he tried to settle into his own bed, Whiskey began a pitiful crying that seemed to echo through the cabin. After 10 minutes of listening to the heartbroken sounds, Silas gave up. He retrieved the kitten and its blanket, settling both. On the bed beside him, Whiskey immediately curled up against his side, purring with a volume that seemed impossible for such a small creature. As he lay in the darkness listening to that contented rumble, Silas felt something shift inside his chest. For 8 years, he'd lived in this cabin with only his memories for company. For 8 years, he'd told himself that solitude was what he wanted, that people, and all the pain that came with caring about them, were better left behind. But now, with this tiny life depending on him, trusting him, needing him, he wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe what he'd called peace was really just another kind of death. Maybe Mary wouldn't have wanted him to spend the rest of his life hiding from the world. The kitten stirred against his ribs, and Silas reached down to stroke the soft fur with one gentle finger. Tomorrow, he'd start the real work of nursing Whiskey. Back to health. He'd need to give the little one proper baths, figure out better feeding arrangements, maybe even make a trip down to the trading post for supplies. For the first time in 8 years, Silas Boone had something to look forward to, besides simply surviving until spring. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the cabin, a broken man and a rescued kitten slept peacefully side by side, both of them healing in ways they didn't yet understand. 3 weeks had passed since Whiskey's arrival, and the transformation was remarkable. What had once been a pitiful, half-dead scrap of fur was now a sleek, healthy young cat with striking amber and black markings. Silas had spent hours gently bathing away the grime, revealing a coat that shifted from deep brown to golden tan, depending on how the light caught it. The kitten's injured eye had healed completely, leaving Whiskey with 2 bright green eyes that seemed to notice everything. But it was more than just the physical recovery that caught Silas's attention. Whiskey had grown fast, faster than any kitten he'd ever seen. In 3 weeks it had gone from fitting in his palm to being nearly the size of a half-grown cat. Its paws seemed disproportionately large, and when it stretched, Silas could see the lean muscle already developing beneath that glossy coat. The kitten's behavior was unusual too. It showed none of the playful clumsiness typical of young cats. Instead, Whiskey moved with a fluid grace that spoke of natural hunting instincts. It watched birds through the cabin windows with an intensity that made Silas slightly uncomfortable, and more than once he'd caught it stalking his movements around the cabin with the focused attention of a predator. Still, these were small concerns compared to the unexpected joy the little creature had brought into his life. For the first time in 8 years, Silas woke each morning to something other than silence. Whiskey would greet him with soft, chirping sounds and insist on supervising his morning routine. The cabin felt alive in a way it hadn't since Mary's death. On this particular morning, as Silas checked his snares in the thin November light, he heard the distant sound of horse hooves on rocky ground. Visitors were rare this high in the mountains, especially as winter approached. He made his way back toward the cabin, Whiskey padding silently beside him. Another oddity, as most cats made some noise when they moved. The rider who emerged from the tree line was Jacob Henley, a weathered trader who made irregular rounds through the remote settlements. Silas had known Jacob for years, back when he still ventured down to the trading posts. The man was honest in his dealings and had a good eye for quality goods, but he was also known for his nervous disposition and tendency towards superstition. Silas Boone, Jacob called out, raising one hand in greeting. Didn't expect to find you still up here this late in the season. Jacob, Silas nodded, approaching the mounted man. "What brings you up this way? Most folks are settling in for winter." "By now," Jakob dismounted, his movements quick and jerky as always. He was a thin man with greying hair and eyes that never seemed to settle on one thing for long. "Trading business down in Millerville. Heard tell you might be needing supplies." "I manage well enough," Silas replied, though he was curious about what news Jacob might bring from the outside world. "Coffee's hot if you want some." As they walked toward the cabin, Whiskey appeared from behind the woodpile, moving with that peculiar, silent grace. Jakob stopped dead in his tracks, his face going pale. "What in blazes is that?" he whispered, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. Silas looked down at Whiskey, who sat calmly watching the stranger with those intelligent green eyes. "Just a kitten I found." "Why?" Jakob shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off. "Whiskey. That ain't no house cat, Silas. Look at the size of those paws. Look at the way it moves." "It's young yet," Silas said, though he felt a flicker of unease at Jacob's reaction. "Still growing into itself. Where'd you find it?" "Right here by my woodpile, half dead from cold and hunger." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying Whiskey with the careful attention he usually reserved for evaluating trade goods. "There's been talk down in the settlements," he said finally. "Strange things happening in these mountains. Folks going missing." "Folks have always gone missing in the mountains," Silas replied. "That's nothing new." "This is different." Jacob's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Tom Fletcher, you remember Tom? Had that claim up on Bear Creek. They found his camp torn apart 3 weeks back. Whatever got him wasn't no ordinary predator." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. 3 weeks ago was exactly when he'd found Whiskey. But that was just coincidence, surely. "Bears! Wake up hungry sometimes." Wasn't no bear sign, Silas, and it wasn't the only incident. Jakob finally tore his gaze away from Whiskey to look at Silas directly. "There's been 3 such attacks in the last month, all of them in this area, all of them leaving the same kind of tracks." "What kind of tracks?" "Big cat tracks. Mountain lion, but larger than any mountain lion has a right to be." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Silas looked down at Whiskey, who had begun grooming one oversized paw with obvious disinterest in the human conversation. "Just a kitten," he told himself. Nothing more than an abandoned kitten. They went inside for coffee, but Jacob remained nervous, his eyes constantly drifting to Whiskey, who had taken up residence on the hearthstones. The trader's unease was infectious, and Silas found himself really looking at his small companion for the first time in days. The proportions were wrong, he realized, with growing unease. The legs were too long for a domestic cat, the chest too broad, and those paws, they were enormous, with claws that seemed unusually thick and sharp. When Whiskey yawned, Silas caught a glimpse of teeth that appeared larger and more pointed than they should be. "You need to be careful up here, Silas," Jacob said as he prepared to leave. "Whatever's been doing the killing, it's still out there, and it's getting bolder." After Jacob rode away, Silas sat on his porch with Whiskey curled in his lap, absently stroking the cat's fur while his mind churned. The kitten, no, he had to stop thinking of it as a kitten, purred contentedly, but the sound seemed deeper than it had just weeks ago. That evening, as Silas prepared his dinner, he heard a commotion from outside. Through his window, he saw Whiskey in the small clearing behind the cabin, crouched over something large and still. When Silas went to investigate, he found his companion standing over a full-grown rabbit, its neck cleanly broken. The sight stopped him cold. A few weeks ago, Whiskey could barely hold its head up to drink milk. Now it had killed prey nearly as large as itself with apparent ease. And the way it had killed, that precise break of the neck, spoke of instincts far beyond those of any domestic cat. Whiskey looked up at him with those green eyes, and for a moment Silas saw something wild and alien in that gaze, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the mountain lions he'd occasionally glimpsed in the high country. Solitary predators that could kill a man as easily as a rabbit. That night, as Whiskey curled up beside him on the bed, Silas lay, Awake, staring at the ceiling, he reached up to touch Mary's ring where it hung against his chest, remembering her voice, her gentle way with animals. Mary had always said that love could tame the wildest heart, but she'd also been practical about the nature of wild things. Some creatures are meant to be wild, she'd told him once, when he'd wanted to keep an injured hawk after it had healed. You can care for them, help them, even love them, but you can't change what they are. Beside him, Whiskey stirred and made a sound that was part purr, part growl. In the darkness, Silas could feel the solid weight and growing strength of the creature he'd rescued. Whatever Whiskey was becoming, it was happening fast. And for the first time since that morning 3 weeks ago, Silas wondered if his act of mercy might have been a terrible mistake. Outside, the November wind carried the scent of snow and the distant howl of wolves. But somewhere in that sound, Silas thought he heard something else, a wild call that seemed to resonate from the warm body sleeping beside him. He didn't sleep well that night. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled 3 feet deep around the cabin and winds that howled like banshees through the mountain passes. Silas had always welcomed winter's isolation before, but this year felt different. This year, he wasn't truly alone. Whiskey had grown again, now nearly the size of a small dog with lean muscle rippling beneath its thick coat. The creature moved through the cabin with fluid grace, its paws making no sound on the wooden floors. More disturbing still were the sounds it made. Not quite meows anymore, but low chirps and trills that reminded Silas uncomfortably of the mountain lions he'd heard calling across distant ridges. 2 months had passed since Jacob's visit, and Silas had tried to convince himself that the trader's fears were unfounded. Whiskey showed him nothing but affection, greeting him each morning with gentle head bumps and following him around the cabin like a devoted pet. When Silas sat by the fire in the evenings, Whiskey would curl up beside his chair, purring with that deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. But the hunting continued. Every few days, Silas would find fresh kills around the property, rabbits, squirrels, even a young deer that Whiskey had somehow brought down despite being less than half its size. The precision of these kills troubled him. There was never any playing with prey, no messy tearing at carcasses, just clean, efficient death delivered with surgical precision. On this particular morning, as Silas chopped ice from the water barrel, he heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Someone was approaching on foot, which was unusual. Most visitors came on horseback or with pack animals. He set down his axe and watched as a figure emerged from the tree line. It was a young man, maybe 25, struggling through the deep snow with obvious difficulty. His clothes were city-made and inadequate for mountain winter, and frost had already formed on his thin moustache. In his hand, he carried what looked like a letter. "Mr. Boone," the young man called out, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. "Are you Silas Boone?" "I am," Silas replied, moving to help the clearly exhausted visitor. "What brings you up here in weather like this?" "Message from Jacob Henley," the young man gasped, gratefully accepting Silas's support. Said it was urgent. Inside the cabin, Silas gave the messenger hot coffee and a place by the fire while he examined the letter. It was hastily written, the ink smeared in places as if Jacob had been in a hurry. "Silas, more attacks. 4 more men dead in the last month, all in your area. Tracks leading up toward your ridge. Sheriff's talking about organizing a hunting party. Be careful. That thing you got up there, it ain't what you think it is. Get rid of it before it kills you too. J.H." The letter was tucked under a rock by his door, left there while he'd been working away from the cabin. Jacob hadn't wanted to risk another face-to-face encounter with Whiskey. Silas read the letter twice, his stomach growing colder with each word. 4 more deaths, all in his area. He looked across the room to where Whiskey lay stretched out near the fireplace. Apparently asleep. In the warm light, the creature looked peaceful, almost innocent. But those powerful shoulders and oversized paws told a different story. After the messenger left, with strict instructions to follow the main trail down and not to travel alone, Silas found himself studying Whiskey with new eyes. The creature was definitely not a domestic cat. The proportions were all wrong, the build too powerful, the instincts too perfectly honed for killing. That afternoon he decided to test his growing suspicions. He gathered up his hunting rifle, a .30-30 Winchester, that had served him well for years, and checked to make sure it was properly cleaned and loaded. The weight of the weapon felt solid and reassuring in his hands, but also carried implications he didn't want to face. As if sensing his mood, Whiskey appeared at his side, looking up at him with those intelligent green eyes. For a moment, man and animal regarded each other in silence. Then Whiskey did something that made Silas's blood run cold. It reached up with one paw and gently touched the rifle barrel, almost as if it understood exactly what the weapon was for. "What are you?" Silas whispered. Whiskey made one of its soft, trilling sounds and rubbed against his leg, the picture of feline affection. But there was something in its eyes, some flicker of awareness that went far beyond ordinary animal intelligence. That evening, as Silas tried to concentrate on mending a torn shirt, he became aware that Whiskey was watching him with unusual intensity. When he looked up, he found the creature sitting perfectly still about 6 feet away, its gaze fixed on his face with predatory focus. "What is it, Whiskey?" he asked. The creature didn't respond, didn't move, just continued that unblinking stare. For nearly 10 minutes they remained like that, man and animal, locked in some kind of silent communication that Silas didn't understand. Finally, Whiskey yawned, showing teeth that were definitely too large and too sharp, and padded over to curl up by the fire. But the feeling of being evaluated, of being sized up by a potential predator, lingered long into the night. Silas found himself thinking about Mary again, reaching up to touch her ring through his shirt. She'd always had an intuitive understanding of animals, could gentle the most skittish horse or coax a frightened bird to eat from her hand. What would she have made of Whiskey? Would she have seen the same troubling signs, or would her gentle nature have blinded her to the growing danger? He remembered a conversation they'd had once about a neighbor's dog that had started showing aggressive behavior after being injured. Mary had insisted the animal could be helped, could be saved with enough patience and love. Silas had been more practical, arguing that some damage couldn't be undone, that sometimes the kindest thing was also the hardest thing. In the end, the dog had bitten a child, and Silas had been the one to put it down. Now, watching Whiskey sleep by the dying fire, he wondered if he was facing the same impossible choice. The creature had shown him nothing but affection, had brought unexpected joy back into his lonely life. But if Jacob was right, if Whiskey was responsible for the deaths of 4 men, then his feelings didn't matter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow against the windows. Somewhere in that howling sound, Silas thought he heard an answering call from the creature sleeping peacefully beside his chair. He spent the night sitting up with his rifle across his knees, watching Whiskey sleep and trying to decide what kind of man he was, the kind who could kill something he loved to protect others, or the kind who would let sentiment blind him to harsh realities. By morning, he still didn't have an answer. Winter deepened around the cabin like a closing fist, sealing Silas and Whiskey into their small world of firelight and storm-muffled silence. The snow had piled so high against the north wall that Silas had to dig a tunnel just to reach his woodshed. In this white isolation, with the nearest human being days away through impassable drifts, the question of what Whiskey truly was became both more urgent and more impossible to resolve. The creature's hunting instincts had become undeniable. What had started with rabbits and squirrels had escalated to larger prey. Just yesterday, Silas had discovered the partially buried remains of a full-grown elk behind the cabin. The kill was clean and efficient. the animal's neck broken with surgical precision, but the sheer size of the prey was staggering. Whiskey couldn't weigh more than 40 pounds, yet somehow it had brought down an animal 10 times its size. When Silas had confronted Whiskey about the kill, the creature had simply looked at him with those unnervingly intelligent green eyes and made a soft chirping sound, as if to say, "I'm only doing what comes naturally." The complete lack of shame or guilt in that response was perhaps more disturbing than the kill itself. Silas had tried to establish boundaries, to teach Whiskey to hunt more appropriately. He'd attempted to train the creature like a dog, using commands and rewards to shape its behavior, but Whiskey seemed to view these efforts with patient amusement, going through the motions when Silas was watching, but reverting to its natural instincts the moment his back was turned. The rifle had become a constant presence in the cabin. Silas cleaned it every day, kept it loaded and within easy reach. He told himself it was just mountain practicality. Winter brought desperate predators down from the high country, and a man alone needed to be prepared. But late at night, when he felt those green eyes watching him from across the room, he knew the weapon's true purpose. On a grey afternoon, when the wind had finally died to a whisper, Silas heard the distant sound of approaching horses. The sound was wrong somehow, too urgent, too purposeful for casual travelers. He peered through the frost-covered window and saw 3 riders struggling through the deep snow, their mounts laboring with every step. As they drew closer, Silas recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Tom Bradley from Millerville, a solid man in his 40s who'd served with distinction in the war. Behind him rode 2 deputies. Both young men Silas didn't know. All 3 carried rifles, and their faces held the grim determination of men on serious business. Whiskey had vanished the moment the riders appeared, melting away into the cabin's shadows with that uncanny silence. Silas stepped onto his porch. As the men approached, his own rifle held, casually but ready. "Sheriff Bradley," he called out. "Hard traveling in weather like this, Silas." The sheriff dismounted, his movements stiff from cold and hard riding. "We need to talk." They stomped the snow from their boots and crowded into the cabin's warmth. Sheriff Bradley accepted coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the hot mug like it was a lifeline. His deputies stood near the door, their eyes constantly scanning the room. "I suppose you've heard about the troubles we've been having," Bradley said without preamble. "Jacob mentioned some attacks," Silas replied carefully. "Mountain lions," he said. "6 men dead now," Bradley continued, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "All killed the same way, necks broken clean through. Whatever's doing this is bigger and stronger than any mountain lion we've seen before." One of the deputies, a nervous young man with pale eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "What?" "Deputy Morrison's trying to say," Bradley interrupted, "is that the tracks we've been following lead right up this ridge, right toward your cabin." The words hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. Silas felt his grip tighten on his coffee mug, but kept his expression neutral. "Tracks can be misleading in weather like this. Snow drifts, wind covers things up. These tracks are fresh, Silas, made within the last few days." Bradley leaned forward, his eyes serious. "I've known you for 15 years. You're a good man, and I don't want to think you'd harbor something dangerous. But I have to ask, have you seen anything unusual up here? Any sign of a large predator?" Before Silas could answer, there was a soft sound from the corner near the fireplace. All 4 men turned to see Whiskey emerging from the shadows, moving with that fluid grace that was becoming more disturbing with each passing day. The creature was larger than when Jacob had last seen it, its shoulders broader, its movements more overtly predatory. Deputy Morrison actually reached for his sidearm before Bradley stopped him with a sharp gesture. "That's quite a cat you've got there," the sheriff said, his voice carefully neutral. "Found it as a kitten," Silas replied. "Half dead from cold and hunger." "When was that?" "Late October." Bradley exchanged glances with his deputies. The attack started in early November. The implication was clear, hanging in the air between them like a loaded gun. Whiskey padded across the room and settled beside Silas's chair, fixing the three lawmen with an unblinking stare. In the firelight, its eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. "That's no house cat," Morrison whispered. Bradley studied Whiskey with the careful attention of a man who'd tracked dangerous animals before. "What do you think it is, Silas?" "I think it's a creature that needed help," Silas said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Nothing more." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, watching Whiskey with obvious unease. The creature stared back without fear, its tail twitching slightly in what might have been amusement or annoyance. "We'll be organizing hunting parties," Bradley said finally. "Bringing in men who know these mountains. Whatever's been killing folks, we're going to find it and put it down." After the lawmen left, struggling back down the mountain through the deepening snow, Silas sat alone with Whiskey by the dying fire. The creature had resumed its usual spot on the hearthstones, grooming its thick coat with methodical precision. But Silas could feel the tension in the air, could sense that something fundamental had changed. "They're going to come for you," he said quietly. "They're going to come with guns and dogs and the determination of men who've seen too much death." Whiskey paused in its grooming to look at him, and for a moment Silas saw something in those green eyes that might have been understanding. The creature made one of its soft, trilling sounds and resumed cleaning its paw, seemingly unconcerned by the threat. But that night, as Silas lay in bed with his rifle close at hand, he heard Whiskey moving restlessly around the cabin. The creature's usual peaceful sleep had been replaced by alert vigilance, as if it too understood that their isolated world was about to change forever. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the distant sound of wolves calling across the frozen wilderness. Soon, Silas knew there would be other sounds in the night, the sounds of men and dogs closing in on their prey. He reached up to touch Mary's ring and wondered if he would have the strength to do what needed to be done when the time came. Spring arrived late in the Wyoming territory that year, creeping up the mountainsides like a cautious animal testing for danger. The snow began its slow retreat in early April, revealing a landscape transformed by months of winter's grip. Silas emerged from his cabin into air that carried the scent of melting ice and awakening earth, grateful to stretch his legs beyond the confines of his small world. Whiskey had grown again during the long winter months. The creature now stood, nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, its coat a magnificent blend of tawny gold and deep brown that caught the spring sunlight like burnished copper. There was no longer any pretense that this was a domestic cat. Whiskey moved with the fluid power of a true predator, its muscles rippling beneath that thick fur with every step. But it was the intelligence in those green eyes that truly unsettled Silas. Whiskey watched the world with an awareness that seemed almost human in its complexity. When Silas worked around the cabin, he could feel that steady gaze following his every movement, evaluating, calculating, understanding in ways that no ordinary animal should. The creature had also begun to disappear for longer periods. Sometimes Whiskey would vanish for 2 or 3 days at a time, returning with the satisfied air of a successful hunter. Silas tried not to think about what those hunts might involve, but the reports filtering up from the settlements painted an increasingly grim picture. On this particular morning, as Silas checked his winter-damaged roof for loose shingles, he heard the distant sound of wagon wheels and voices. A family was making its way up the mountain trail, unusual for this early in the season, when the passes were still treacherous with snowmelt and loose rock. Silas quickly whistled for Whiskey, a sharp sound that brought the creature padding silently to his side. "Inside," he commanded, pointing toward the cabin. For once, Whiskey obeyed without argument, vanishing through the door like a golden shadow. The wagon that emerged from the tree line carried a young family, a man and woman, in their 20s, with 2 small children bundled against the mountain chill. Their belongings were strapped haphazardly to the wagon bed, and their clothes spoke of recent prosperity turned to desperate flight. "Morning, stranger," the man called out, raising one hand in greeting. His voice carried the educated accent of the eastern settlements. "We're looking for the trail to Bear Creek Canyon. Been told there's good farmland up that way." Silas walked down to meet them, noting the woman's frightened eyes and the way she held her children close. "Name's Silas Boone. Bear Creek's another day's travel north, but the trail's still blocked with snowfall. You'd be better off waiting another month before trying to get through." "We can't wait," the woman said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We have to keep moving." The man, who introduced himself as David Hartwell, explained their situation. They'd lost their farm to bank foreclosure back in Colorado, but more than that, they were fleeing something. David was vague about the details, but Silas caught enough to understand they were running from some kind of trouble that made mountain travel in early spring seem like the safer option. "You're welcome to rest here for the night," Silas offered, though part of him worried about Whiskey's reaction to strangers. "Got a spare room and hot food." As the family settled in, Silas found himself acutely aware of the moral weight of his situation. Here were innocent people, children no less, sleeping under the same roof as a creature that might be a killer. The boy couldn't be more than 8 years old, with bright blue eyes and endless questions about mountain life. The girl was even younger, maybe 5, and she watched the world with the fearless curiosity of childhood. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, little Sarah Hartwell asked the question Silas had been dreading. "Do you have any pets, Mr. Boone?" she asked, her small face earnest in the firelight. "I do have a cat," Silas replied carefully, "but it's sleeping right now. Can we see it tomorrow?" The boy, Tommy, chimed in. "I love cats." David Hartwell noticed Silas's hesitation. "We don't want to impose. Children can be a bit much around animals sometimes." "It's not that," Silas said, choosing his words carefully. "My cat is, well, it's not used to strangers. Might be better to leave it." Later that night, after the family had settled into the small spare room Silas had built years ago for storage, he sat alone by the dying fire with Mary's Bible open in his lap. The book was one of his most treasured possessions, filled with pressed flowers Mary had collected and annotated with her careful handwriting in the margins. He often turned to it when he needed guidance, finding comfort in her gentle wisdom, even years after her death. Tonight, he found himself reading the parable of the Good Samaritan, Mary's notes filling the margins with observations about compassion and moral responsibility. "Sometimes, helping one person means risking harm to others," she had written in her neat script. "That's when we must pray for wisdom to know the right path." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, sheltering a family, while harboring something that might pose a greater threat to them than whatever they were fleeing. Through the window, he could see Whiskey's silhouette moving restlessly around the property, the creature apparently agitated by the presence of strangers. Around midnight, Silas was startled awake by the sound of Sarah crying. He found the little girl standing by the window in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "There's something outside," she whispered, "something with scary eyes." Silas looked through the window and saw Whiskey sitting in the moonlight about 20 feet from the cabin, motionless as a statue. The creature's eyes reflected the pale light like green lanterns, and it was staring directly at the window where the child stood. "It's just my cat," Silas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It won't hurt you." "It's too big to be a cat," Sarah said with the honest clarity of childhood. "And it looks hungry." Silas picked up the little girl and carried her back to a bed, but her words echoed in his mind long after she'd fallen asleep. Through the thin walls, he could hear her parents whispering worriedly to each other, and he knew they'd seen Whiskey too. The next morning, the family left early, declining Silas's offer of breakfast and pushing on toward Bear Creek Canyon despite his warnings about the dangerous trail conditions. As their wagon disappeared into the forest, David Hartwell's parting words rang in Silas's ears. "You should be careful up here, Mr. Boone. There are things in these mountains that don't belong near civilized folk." Alone again with whiskey, Silas felt the full weight of his impossible situation. The creature padded over to him and rubbed against his leg with apparent affection, but the gesture no longer brought him comfort. How many other families would pass this way as spring progressed? How many innocent lives was he potentially putting at risk by keeping whiskey? He opened Mary's Bible again, searching for answers in her gentle words, but finding only more questions about the nature of love, responsibility, and the terrible choices that sometimes defined a man's character. 3 days after the Hartwell family's departure, Silas discovered the abandoned campsite. He'd been following an old game trail down toward the creek when he spotted the torn canvas and scattered belongings through the trees. What he found there made his blood run cold. The sight was a scene of chaos and violence. A wagon lay overturned, its contents strewn across the forest floor like the scattered pieces of broken lives. Children's clothing hung from tree branches, torn and stained with something dark. A child's wooden toy horse lay half buried in the mud, one leg snapped clean off. But it was the silence that truly disturbed him. No birds sang in the trees around the campsite. No insects buzzed in the warming air. Even the creek seemed to whisper, more quietly here, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Silas moved through the scene with the careful attention of a man who'd seen violence before. The wagon tracks showed where the family had tried to turn around, probably realizing too late that they'd made a terrible mistake. Deep gouges in the earth suggested a struggle, something large and powerful, bringing down prey much smaller than itself. He found the first body 20 yards from the overturned wagon. David Hartwell lay crumpled against a fallen log, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. The man's face was frozen in an expression of desperate determination, one hand still reaching toward where his family had been. The woman was found further, into the trees, clutching a blood-stained shawl that might once have belonged to little Sarah. Her body told the story of a mother's final, futile attempt to protect her children. But of Tommy and Sarah themselves, there was no sign except for those torn pieces of clothing and a child's shoe found near the creek bank. Silas knelt beside the woman's body, his hands shaking as he gently closed her sightless eyes. These were the people who had sat at his table just 3 nights ago, sharing his food and warming themselves by his fire. The little girl who had seen Whiskey's scary eyes and spoken with the honest clarity of childhood about things that didn't belong. Near civilized folk, as he stood in that silent place of death, Silas felt something change inside his chest, a hardening that reminded him of cold iron. He looked around the destroyed campsite one more time, memorizing every detail, every piece of evidence that spoke to the methodical savagery of the attack. The tracks were unmistakable. Large paw prints, too big for any domestic cat, pressed deep into the soft earth. The spacing and depth suggested something that moved with incredible power and precision, something that had been absent from his cabin for 3 days. That evening, Whiskey returned home as the sun set behind the western peaks. The creature padded silently up to the cabin, its coat gleaming in the fading light, and settled on the porch as if nothing had changed. But Silas noticed things he'd been blind to before. The way Whiskey's muzzle had been recently cleaned, the satisfied languor in its movements, the complete absence of hunger in its demeanor. "Where have you been?" Silas asked, his voice steady. Despite the rage building in his chest, Whiskey looked up at him with those intelligent green eyes and made one of its soft, trilling sounds. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an ordinary response from a pet greeting its owner, but Silas heard something different now, a note of satisfaction, almost of pride. He spent that night searching Whiskey for any evidence that might confirm his growing certainty. The creature submitted to his examination with patient tolerance, allowing him to check its claws, its teeth, its thick coat. But Whiskey was too smart to return home with obvious signs of violence. Whatever had happened at that campsite, the predator had been careful to clean itself thoroughly. Still, there were subtle signs for those who knew how to look. A small tear in the creature's ear that hadn't been there before. scratches on its shoulder that spoke of struggle. And beneath it all, despite the careful grooming, the faint scent of something that might have been human fear. The next morning brought another visitor, Sheriff Bradley, riding alone this time and looking haggard from too many sleepless nights. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying a weight that threatened to crush him. "Found them," he said without preamble, accepting the coffee Silas offered with grateful hands. "The Hartwell family, what was left of them." "All of them?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Parents for certain. Children." Bradley's voice trailed off, and he stared into his coffee cup as if seeking answers in its dark depths. "We found pieces. Enough to know." They sat in silence for a long moment. Two men who'd seen too much of death's handiwork. Somewhere in the cabin, whiskey moved with its characteristic silence, and Silas saw Bradley's eyes track the sound. "The tracks at the scene," Bradley continued. "They match the ones we've been following. Same size, same spacing. Whatever killed those folks is the same thing that's been terrorizing these mountains for months." Silas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "The thing is," Bradley said, leaning forward with the intensity of a man grasping for hope, "the tracks lead away from the campsite and back up this ridge, back toward your cabin. Lots of animals use these trails," Silas replied, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. "Not animals that leave tracks like these." Bradley pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and spread it on the table. It was a crude sketch of a paw print, carefully measured and annotated. "My deputy Morrison served with the army out in California. Says he's seen tracks like this before when they were hunting rogue mountain lions that had developed a taste for human flesh." The sketch might as well have been a drawing of whiskey's paw. Every detail matched: the size, the shape, the spacing of the toe pads. "We're organizing a proper hunt," Bradley continued, "bringing in professional trackers and experienced hunters. This thing has killed its last innocent person." After the sheriff left, Silas sat alone in his cabin with the sketch spread before him. Whiskey appeared from wherever it had been hiding and jumped onto the table, settling down directly on top of the paper. The creature looked at him with what might have been amusement, as if it understood exactly what the sketch represented and found the whole situation entertaining. For the first time since he'd found the small, dying kitten by his woodpile, Silas looked at Whiskey and felt no affection, no protective instinct, no connection at all. What he felt instead was a cold, hard certainty that made his next decision inevitable. He reached for his rifle and began to clean it with methodical precision. Whiskey watched him work, those green eyes reflecting the lamplight like twin flames. Neither of them moved until the weapon was spotless and loaded, ready for the work that lay ahead. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of spring flowers and the distant promise of summer. But inside the cabin, winter had returned, a winter of the heart that would not end until justice was served and innocence avenged. The next morning, Silas rose before dawn with the grim determination of a man who'd finally accepted an unthinkable task. His rifle was loaded and ready, and his heart had hardened into something that felt like cold stone. Whiskey had to die. The creature he'd rescued, raised, and loved had become a monster that killed children, and his feelings no longer mattered. But as he stepped onto his porch in the gray pre-dawn light, he found Whiskey waiting for him with an unusual intensity in its posture. The creature sat perfectly still, its green eyes fixed on something in the distance. Its ears were pricked forward, and every muscle in its powerful body seemed coiled for action. Silas followed Whiskey's gaze and saw nothing but forest and morning. Mist. But the creature's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen before. Not the casual alertness of a predator spotting prey, but something more urgent, almost desperate. Whiskey looked back at him once, made a soft chirping sound, then padded down off the porch and into the trees. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back again, as if waiting for him to follow. Against every instinct that told him to end this here and now, Silas found himself trailing after the creature that had haunted his conscience for months. Whiskey. moved through the forest with purpose, leading him along game trails and through thick underbrush with the confidence of something that knew exactly where it was going. They traveled for nearly an hour, climbing higher into the mountains than Silas had ventured in years. The terrain grew rougher, marked by steep ravines and tumbled rocks that spoke of ancient avalanches. Finally, Whiskey stopped at the edge of a narrow canyon and sat down, its tail twitching with obvious agitation. Silas approached cautiously, his rifle ready, and peered down into the rocky gorge. What he saw there made him question everything he thought he knew about the past months. Hidden in the shadows of an overhanging cliff was a crude camp, lean-to shelters made from branches and animal hides, fire rings blackened with use, and equipment scattered around with the careless confidence of men who thought themselves safe from discovery. But it was the cages that made Silas's blood run cold. Wooden and iron crates, some large enough to hold a man, others sized for smaller creatures. Several contained the remains of animals, wolves, bears, even what looked like a young elk. But one cage held something that made Silas's stomach lurch with horrified understanding. Fresh human bones, picked clean and arranged with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this work many times before. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, Silas began to make out more details of the hidden camp. Traps and snares hung from tree branches, not the simple devices used by honest trappers, but cruel contraptions designed to cause maximum pain and terror. A rough table held tools that belonged in a torture chamber, not a hunting camp. And everywhere, scattered like trophies, were personal belongings that told stories of lives cut short. A woman's hair ribbon, a man's pocket watch, children's shoes, small and heartbreakingly innocent. A sound from deeper in the canyon made Silas freeze. Voices, rough and filled with cruel laughter, echoing off the rock walls. He pressed himself against a boulder and listened as two men discussed their plans in terms that made his skin crawl. "The family was good sport," one voice said, thick with satisfaction. "Kids always run the prettiest patterns when they're scared." "Cutter's got a buyer lined up for the next catch," another replied. "Wants them alive this time. Says rich folks. Back east, pay extra for hunting parties where the prey can scream." Silas felt the world shift beneath his feet as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. These weren't ordinary trappers or hunters. These were men who hunted human beings for sport and profit, selling victims to wealthy sadists who paid for the privilege of hunting the most dangerous game of all. The Hartwell family hadn't been killed by Whiskey. They'd been murdered by monsters in human form. Movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention, and he turned to see Whiskey creeping along the canyon's edge with deadly purpose. The creature's whole posture had changed, transformed. From the affectionate companion he'd known into something that radiated lethal intent. This wasn't the behavior of a predator seeking prey. This was the focused aggression of a protector hunting killers. As Silas watched in stunned silence, Whiskey descended into the canyon with liquid grace, moving from shadow to shadow with supernatural stealth. The creature was hunting, but not for innocent victims. It was hunting the hunters. The first scream echoed up from the canyon floor 10 minutes later, a sound of pure terror that spoke to some primal fear of being stalked by something vaster, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous than oneself. Then came shouts, gunfire, and the sounds of men fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't understand. Silas scrambled down into the canyon, following a treacherous path between loose rocks and scrub brush. What he found at the bottom confirmed his growing understanding of how completely wrong he'd been about everything. A man lay dead beside the crude camp's fire ring, his neck broken with the same precision Silas had seen at other death scenes. But this wasn't an innocent victim. This was one of the killers. And scattered around his body were journals, maps, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic evil. Cutter's collection journal, as the ledger was titled, contained meticulous records of dozens of victims. Families lured into remote areas with promises of land or work. then captured and sold to wealthy clients who paid handsomely for the privilege of hunting human prey. The Hartwells were just the most recent entry in a catalogue of horror that stretched back years. But the journal also contained something else, detailed observations about a rogue predator that had been systematically hunting Kutten's operation for months. The creature, described as unnaturally large mountain lion with exceptional intelligence, had killed 6 of Kutten's men and freed several captured victims. Whiskey hadn't been the monster terrorizing the mountains. Whiskey had been hunting the real monsters. A sound from deeper in the camp drew Silas's attention. He found Whiskey standing over another body, a man whose fancy clothes and soft hands marked him as one of the wealthy clients who came here to indulge their twisted appetites. The creature looked up at Silas with those intelligent green eyes, and for the first time in months he saw no wildness there, no alien hunger. What he saw was a protector that had been doing dangerous, necessary work while he'd been blind to the truth. "You've been fighting them," Silas whispered, understanding flooding through him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "All this time, you've been protecting people." Whiskey made one of its soft, trilling sounds and padded over to a cage that still held a survivor, a young woman, barely alive but breathing. As Silas worked to free her, he realized that everything he'd believed about Whiskey's nature had been filtered through fear and misunderstanding. The creature wasn't a killer of innocence. It was their guardian. But as he helped the rescued woman to her feet, supporting her trembling weight, Silas heard new sounds echoing through the canyon. More voices, more footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of men approaching with weapons and purpose. Cutter himself was returning to his hidden camp, and he wasn't alone. Whiskey's ears flattened against its head, and the creature moved to place itself between Silas and the approaching danger. For the first time since finding that dying kitten by his woodpile, Silas understood what he was really looking at. Not a pet, not a monster, but a partner in a fight he hadn't even known was happening. The real battle was just beginning. The rescued woman could barely stand, her legs shaking from weeks of captivity and terror. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair matted by dirt and fear-filled eyes that darted constantly toward the canyon's entrance. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "They took my husband," she managed, clutching Silas's arm with desperate strength. "Samuel Brennan. They said he was for the hunt today. Special clients paying extra." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. The journal had mentioned today's date specifically, a premium experience for clients willing to pay top dollar for the most dangerous game. Somewhere in these mountains, innocent people were being hunted like animals, while wealthy sadists enjoyed their twisted sport. The sound of approaching voices grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls with the confidence of men returning to their stronghold. Cutter was coming back, and from the sound of it he wasn't alone. Multiple voices, at least 4 or 5 men, all armed and dangerous. Whiskey moved to the canyon's edge, every muscle tense with anticipation. The creature's transformation was complete. Gone was any pretense of domesticity, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator preparing for war. But now Silas understood that this wasn't the mindless aggression of a killer. This was the righteous fury of a protector facing evil. "We need to get out of here," Silas whispered to the woman, helping her toward the narrow path he'd used to descend into the canyon. But she shook her head weakly. "Can't leave Samuel. Can't leave the others." Others? 3 more cages, hidden, deeper in the canyon. 2 children and an old man. They're saving them for tomorrow's hunt. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. More innocent people, including children, were trapped somewhere in this maze of rock and shadow. He could take this woman and flee, probably make it back to his cabin in safety. But that would mean abandoning helpless victims to unspeakable horror. He looked at Whiskey, who was watching him with those intelligent green eyes. The creature seemed to understand the moral weight of the moment, the choice between safety and duty. There was no judgment in that gaze, but there was something else. a willingness to follow whatever path Silas chose, no matter how dangerous. For 8 years, Silas had hidden from the world and its complications. For 8 years, he told himself that solitude was wisdom, that avoiding involvement was the safest course. But standing in this place of evil, holding a trembling woman who'd survived unspeakable horrors, he realized that some things mattered. More than safety, he thought of Mary, of her gentle hands tending wounded animals, and her fierce protection of anything helpless. She would never have walked away from this, would never have chosen comfort over conscience. The ring he wore around his neck seemed to grow warm against his chest, as if her spirit was giving him strength for what lay ahead. "How many men does Kitten have?" he asked the woman quietly. 6, maybe 7. They have guns and they know these canyons better than anyone. Silas checked his rifle, counting the cartridges in his pocket. Not enough for a prolonged fight, especially against multiple armed opponents who held every advantage. But he'd faced worse odds during his younger days, and he'd never had a partner. Like whiskey. The voices were getting closer. Silas could make out individual words now, crude jokes about their victims, casual discussion of torture and murder as if they were talking about the weather. These weren't men driven to evil by desperation or circumstance. They were monsters who chose cruelty because they enjoyed it. "Listen to me," Silas said to the woman, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made hard decisions before. "There's a path up the canyon's north wall, about 50 yards from here. Follow it to the top, then head west toward the sun. Keep walking until you find a creek, then follow it downstream. Eventually you'll reach the main trail to Millerville." She shook her head. "I won't leave Samuel. You'll die if you stay, and then who's going to tell people about this place? Who's going to make sure these bastards face justice?" His words were harsh but necessary. "Get to town. Find Sheriff Bradley. Tell him everything." Reluctantly, she began making her way toward the path he'd indicated, moving slowly but with growing determination. Silas watched until she disappeared behind a boulder, then turned his attention back to the approaching threat. Whiskey had vanished, melting into the shadows with that supernatural stealth. Silas found himself alone in the camp, surrounded by evidence of systematic evil, waiting for killers to return to their lair. The irony wasn't lost on him. After months of fearing Whiskey was a monster, he was now depending on the creature to help him fight real monsters. He positioned himself behind a fallen log that offered both cover and a clear field of fire toward the canyon's main entrance. From here, he could see most of the camp while remaining hidden from anyone approaching along the main trail. His rifle was loaded and ready, and he had a clear understanding of what needed to be done. The first man to appear was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life in the wilderness. But there was something wrong about his eyes, a coldness that spoke of too much violence witnessed and enjoyed. He carried a military-style rifle and moved with the confidence of a professional killer. Behind him came 4 more men, all armed, all displaying the casual brutality that marked Cutter's operation. They talked among themselves with the easy familiarity of partners in evil, discussing their morning's hunt with obvious satisfaction. "Rich boy from Denver put up a good chase," one of them was saying. "Lasted almost 2 hours before the cat brought him down." "Cutter's got 3 more buyers coming next week," another replied. "Says he wants fresh stock, younger if we can manage it." Silas felt his jaw clench with rage, but forced himself to remain calm. Anger would make him sloppy, and sloppy got people killed. He needed to be smart about this, needed to use every advantage he could find. The last man to emerge from the canyon trail was clearly Cutter himself. He was shorter than the others, but carried himself with the authority of a natural leader. His clothes were expensive, his weapons well-maintained, and his entire demeanor spoke of a man who viewed human suffering as a profitable business venture. "Something's wrong," Cutter said, stopping in the middle of the camp. His voice was educated, cultured, the kind of man who might have been a banker or lawyer in another life. "Where's Peterson?" The men spread out, suddenly alert to danger. They'd found the body of their companion, and their casual confidence was replaced by wary professionalism. These weren't random thugs. They were experienced killers who knew how to handle unexpected threats. "Fresh tracks," one of them called out, kneeling beside a clear paw print in the soft earth. "That damn cat's been here." "Find it," Cutter ordered, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "And find whoever let the woman out of her cage." Silas took careful aim at the nearest gunman, calculating angles and distances with the practiced eye of a marksman. He'd have one clean shot before his position was revealed, maybe two if he was lucky. After that, it would come down to Whiskey's speed and his own ability to stay alive long enough to matter. Somewhere in the shadows, he knew his unusual partner was preparing for battle. The creature that had once seemed like humanity's greatest threat was now humanity's best hope against monsters who wore human faces. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Silas Boone, mountain man, hermit, and reluctant hero, was ready to fight the most important battle of his life. The first shot came without warning, not from Silas's rifle, but from somewhere high above in the canyon walls. One of Cutter's men spun and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The sound echoed off the rock walls like thunder, and suddenly the camp erupted into chaos. "Sniper!" someone shouted, and the remaining men dove for cover behind rocks and equipment. Silas kept his rifle trained on Cutter, but held his fire, trying to understand what was happening. Through the confusion, he caught a glimpse of movement on the canyon's rim, a figure in worn traveling clothes, rifle in hand. The escaped woman hadn't fled toward town as he'd hoped. Instead, she'd found a position where she could provide covering fire. "Sarah Brennan," she called down, her voice carrying newfound strength. "My name is Sarah Brennan, and my husband is somewhere in these mountains. I'm not leaving without him." Cutter's response was immediate and vicious. "Kill her," he snarled to his men, "and find that damn cat before it kills someone else." That's when Whiskey struck. The creature seemed to materialize from the shadows, like a golden nightmare, moving with speed that defied belief. It hit the nearest gunman from behind, driving him to the ground with such force that his rifle went flying. The man's scream was cut short by the distinctive sound of a neck snapping. Chaos transformed into panic as Cutter's professional killers found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they'd encountered. Whiskey moved through their ranks like liquid death, too fast to track, too smart to corner. The creature used the canyon's terrain with supernatural skill, appearing and vanishing among the rocks and shadows. Silas seized the moment, rising from cover to put a 30-30 round through the chest of a man trying to draw a bead on Whiskey. The impact spun the killer around and dropped him beside his fallen companion. 2 down, 4 to go, but these weren't ordinary criminals. Despite their losses, Cutter's remaining men quickly adapted to the threat, spreading out and using overlapping fields of fire to limit Whiskey's options. They'd fought dangerous predators before, and they began working together with the coordination of experienced hunters. "Box it in," Cutter commanded, taking shelter behind an overturned wagon. "Drive it toward the cliff face where it can't maneuver." Sarah Brennan's rifle cracked again from above, forcing one of the gunmen to abandon his position. But her elevated angle limited her targets, and Silas could see she was down to her last few cartridges. A movement to his left caught Silas's attention. One of Cutter's men was working his way around the camp's perimeter, trying to flank his position. Silas swung his rifle around and fired, but the hasty shot went wide, chipping rock inches from the man's head. The return fire was immediate and accurate. Bullets whined past Silas's ears as he dove for better cover, rolling behind a massive boulder as lead sparked off stone around him. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system with the familiar cocktail of fear and determination he remembered from his younger, more violent days. Whiskey appeared again, this time attacking with calculated precision. The creature had learned from observing the men's tactics, and now it struck at the weakest point in their formation. A gunman who'd become separated from his partners suddenly found himself facing 180 pounds of furious mountain lion with nowhere to run. The man's screams echoed through the canyon until they were abruptly cut short. 3 down, 3 to go. But the survivors were learning too. Kitten himself had moved to a position where he could cover the entire camp with his rifle, while his 2 remaining men closed in on Whiskey's last known position. They moved with the methodical precision of professional killers, communicating with hand signals and using suppressing fire to limit their target's options. "It's just an animal," Kitten called out, his voice carrying cold confidence. "Bigger than most, smarter than most, but still just an animal. And I've been hunting animals my whole life." Silas saw the trap closing around his partner. The 2 remaining gunmen were driving Whiskey toward the canyon's dead end, where Kitten waited with his rifle ready, once the creature was pinned against the cliff face. It would be easy prey for 3 experienced marksmen. He had to act now, while Whiskey still had room to maneuver. Silas broke from cover, running across open ground toward a position where he could provide supporting fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet as Kitten and his men shifted their attention to this new threat. But that moment of distraction was all Whiskey needed. The creature vanished among the rocks again, and when it reappeared, it was behind the 2 men who'd been trying to box it in. The attack was swift and silent, 2 quick strikes that left both gunmen motionless on the canyon floor. Now it was just Kitten, alone with his rifle and his rage, facing enemies he'd underestimated. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Kitten shouted, his cultured voice cracking with desperation. "This is a business. There are people who depend on what I provide, important people with important needs." Silas emerged from cover, his rifle trained on the man who'd turned human suffering into profit. "The only thing I understand," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "is that you're done." The final confrontation was about to begin. Cutter's composure cracked like thin ice under pressure. The cultured businessman facade fell away, revealing the snarling predator beneath. He raised his rifle with practiced efficiency, but his hands shook with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've cost me," he spat, swinging the weapon between Silas and the shadows where Whiskey had vanished. "Years of work, hundreds of thousands in profits, clients who trusted me to provide unique experiences." "Unique experiences?" Silas repeated, his voice heavy with disgust. "Is that what you call murdering innocent families?" "I call it business," Kitten replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Supply and demand. There's always been a market for the ultimate hunt. And I simply—" Whiskey's attack came from an impossible angle, the creature somehow launching itself from a narrow ledge 20 feet up the canyon wall. Kitten spun toward the movement, firing wildly as 180 pounds of furious mountain lion descended on him like divine retribution. But Kitten was faster than his dead associates, rolling aside at the last moment and bringing his rifle around in a vicious arc. The weapon's stock caught Whiskey across the ribs with a sickening crack, sending the creature tumbling into the rocks. Silas's rifle boomed, the shot echoing through the canyon like thunder. But Kitten was already moving, diving behind a pile of equipment as the bullet sparked off stone where he'd been standing. "Your pet's hurt," Kitten called out, his voice regaining some of its cold confidence. "I can see it bleeding from here. How long do you think it'll last?" Silas could see Whiskey struggling to rise, favoring its left side where Cutter's blow had landed. Blood matted the creature's golden fur, and its movements lacked their usual fluid grace. The sight filled him with a rage he hadn't felt since Mary's death, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume rational thought. But 8 years of mountain solitude had taught him patience, and patience was what he needed now. Kitten was wounded. Too, a graze across his shoulder from Sarah Brennan's covering fire, and he was down to his last few cartridges. The man was dangerous, but he was also trapped in a canyon with limited escape routes. "Tell me about the cages," Silas called out, keeping his rifle trained on Cutter's position. "The hidden ones. Where are the other prisoners?" Cutter's laugh was like breaking glass. Worried about more strays? There's an old mine shaft about a quarter-mile north of here, 3 cages, 3 prizes, but they won't last long without food and water. The words hit Silas like physical blows. Somewhere, in the mountains, innocent people were dying slowly while he played games with a madman. But rushing would get them all killed, including the victims he was trying to save. Movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Whiskey was on its feet again, moving slowly but with deadly purpose. The creature's intelligence showed in how it used the canyon's terrain, staying low and working its way around Cutter's flanks despite its injuries. "You know what I've learned in 30 years of hunting?" Cutter continued, apparently unaware of Whiskey's repositioning. "Everything dies if you hurt it enough. Even legendary mountain lions bleed out eventually." "Maybe," Silas replied, tracking Whiskey's movement while keeping Cutter talking, "but some things are harder to kill than others." That's when Cutter made his mistake. Confident in his position behind the equipment pile, he rose slightly to get a better shot at Silas's position. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Whiskey struck like lightning, covering the distance between the rocks and Cutter's hiding place in 2 powerful bounds. The creature hit the killer from the side, driving him away from his rifle and into the open ground of the camp. Cutter managed to draw a knife as they went down together, a wicked-looking blade that caught the afternoon light. He slashed wildly at Whiskey, opening a gash across the creature's shoulder, but the mountain lion's jaws were already closing around his wrist. The knife clattered away across the rocks as Cutter screamed, his bones grinding under the pressure of Whiskey's bite. He tried to reach for a pistol with his free hand, but Whiskey's weight pinned him to the ground. Silas approached carefully, his rifle ready but unnecessary. Cutter's eyes darted between him and the creature that held him prisoner, wild with pain and the knowledge of approaching death. "Call it off," Cutter gasped, blood running from where Whiskey's claws had found their mark. "I'll tell you everything. The mine shaft locations, the client lists, the whole operation." Silas looked down at the man who'd turned human suffering into profit, who'd sold children to monsters for sport. He thought of the Hartwell family, of Sarah Brennan's husband, of all the innocents who died to feed Cutter's greed. "Some sins don't get forgiven," he said quietly. Whiskey's jaws tightened, and Thomas Cutter's reign of terror ended with the distinctive sound of snapping bone. In the sudden silence that followed, Silas became aware of Sarah Brennan's voice calling from above. "The mine shaft," she was saying. "We have to find the mine shaft." There were still people to save, and the day's work wasn't finished yet. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in Cutter's Canyon, and the Wyoming territory was settling into the rhythm of summer. The aspens were full green now, their leaves whispering secrets to the mountain wind, and wildflowers painted the meadows in brilliant splashes of color that would have made Mary smile. Silas stood on his porch in the early morning light, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, but the solitude he'd once treasured had been transformed into something richer. The silence was no longer empty, it was peaceful, filled with the knowledge that he'd found his purpose again after 8 years of merely surviving. Whiskey lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight, the creature's injuries long healed, but leaving subtle reminders of that day of reckoning. A thin scar ran across the mountain lion's left shoulder, and it still favored that leg slightly when the weather turned cold. But the intelligence in those green eyes remained undiminished, and the bond between man and beast had deepened into something approaching mystical, because Whiskey was no ordinary mountain lion. Silas had finally accepted. Whatever forces had brought them together, providence, fate, or simple chance, had created something unprecedented. A predator that chose to protect instead of hunt, a wild creature that understood justice and acted upon it with lethal efficiency. The rescued prisoners from Cutter's mine shaft had all survived. Samuel Brennan bore scars both physical and mental from his ordeal, but he was alive and reunited with his wife. The 2 children, a brother and sister whose parents had been among, Cutter's earlier victims had been taken in by relatives back east. The old man, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Stone, had chosen to stay in the territory, claiming he'd found his calling ministering to folks in the remote settlements. Sheriff Bradley rode up the mountain regularly now, not as a lawman investigating crimes, but as a friend sharing news and coffee. The authorities had dismantled Cutter's entire operation based on the evidence found in his canyon hideout. 3 more camps had been discovered, dozens of victims identified, and a network of wealthy clients exposed and prosecuted. Bradley had told Silas that he was a hero, but Silas knew better. The real hero was sleeping in the morning sun beside his chair. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. A rider was making his way up the mountain trail, not unusual anymore since word had spread that Silas Boone's cabin was a safe haven for travelers. What was unusual was the small bundle the rider carried carefully in his arms. The man who dismounted at Silas's porch was young, maybe 30, with the calloused hands of a working man and worry lines around his eyes. He introduced himself as Daniel Mackenzie, a farmer from down in the valley settlements. "Mr. Boone," he said, his voice carrying respectful urgency, "I've brought something that needs your help." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a tiny wolf cub, no more than a few weeks old, with matted grey fur and eyes that held the same desperate hope Silas remembered from another small creature months ago. The cub was injured, clearly orphaned, and would die without immediate care. "Found it near my property," Mackenzie explained. "Mother was killed by hunters, probably for bounty." "I know you have a way with unusual animals." Silas looked down at the wolf cub, then across at Whiskey, who had risen from the sunlight to investigate the newcomer with keen interest. The mountain lion approached slowly, sniffing the small bundle with the careful attention of a potential parent rather than a predator. "Mary used to say that some things happen for a reason," Silas said quietly, accepting the cub into his hands. The tiny creature was warm and trusting, just as Whiskey had been all those months ago. Maybe she was right. As Daniel Mackenzie rode back down the mountain, Silas settled into his chair with the wolf cub nestled against his chest. Whiskey curled up beside him, and for a moment the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence while the sun climbed higher over the peaks. Silas reached up to touch the chain around his neck, but his fingers found something different. Where Mary's wedding ring had hung for 8 years, there was now a collar, a simple leather band he'd crafted himself, threaded through the gold. Chain that had once held only memory and grief. The collar represented more than just Whiskey's place in his life. It symbolized the integration of past and present, love and purpose, solitude and connection. Mary's ring was still there, worked into the leather as a small golden accent, but it no longer dominated the chain. Instead, it was part of something larger, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Over the past months, travelers had begun to speak of the mountain man and his guardian, stories that grew in the telling but remained rooted in truth. Families planning to cross the high country would stop at Silas's cabin for advice and blessing. Children drew pictures of a great golden cat that protected good people from bad ones. And in the settlements, when folks spoke of safety in the wilderness, they spoke of Silas Boone and his unusual partner. But the stories missed the deeper truth. This wasn't about a man and his trained predator. It was about the way broken things could heal each other, about how love could transform the wildest heart without taming it, about finding purpose in the most unexpected partnerships. As the sun reached its zenith, painting the mountain meadows in golden light, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since Mary's death: complete contentment. Not the hollow peace of resignation, but the deep satisfaction of a life lived with meaning. The wolf cub stirred in his arms, making small sounds that spoke of hunger and need. Silas rose from his chair, Whiskey padding silently beside him, and went inside to begin the patient work of nursing another lost soul back to health. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers. and the distant promise of autumn. But inside the cabin, three unlikely companions, a man, a mountain lion, and a wolf cub, began the quiet work of building a family from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. Sometimes the things we save end up saving us, and sometimes salvation comes with claws and golden eyes, and the fierce love of wild hearts choosing to be gentle